I was born in Shale, a little town no longer there in Kern County, California, in 1923. Actually, it was the end of the railroad bringing equipment in for the oil fields. And when I was old enough to see it, it was just a bit of railroad equipment and the cement foundations of some buildings that were stores selling all kinds of oil field equipment. My parents were Jesse Reed Barnes and Thomas Eli Barnes. I was named Mary Amantha after my two grandmothers, whom I never knew. Mary was my dad's mother's name, Mary Thomas. She was 14 when she married my grandfather, who came back from the Civil War. He came back with her brother and needed a place to stay overnight in the hills of Missouri. Her father had just died, and there was no one at that time, to support the family. So actually, her marriage to Samuel Barnes was a blessing because it was one less mouth to feed in that household. They established a little farm nearby, and my dad was the fifth son of the pair, and then there were 5 girls after that. So 10 children. My dad and his brothers came to California around 1915, and they worked for a farmer, rancher in the San Joaquin Valley, Thomas Law Reed. Some of them moved on, but my dad stayed, and he had quite a reputation as the best-looking employee and the best prize fighter on the ranch. My mother, Jessie Reed, who wanted to go to Mills College so badly, was disappointed because her sisters told their father, she's just going to marry Tom Barnes, so no use of wasting that money on her. And so she didn't get to go to Mills College, but she certainly would have excelled had she gone. She helped my dad build their future in the oil fields by helping him put together equipment and figuring out how it was going to work for the company. She was very smart in mathematics and didn't have the opportunity to go ahead and do the things she would have liked to have done. My mother and father had 4 sons before I was born. Thomas Reed Barnes, who we called Reed, and Samuel Claiborne Barnes, who died at age 4 in a fire, a tragedy for the family. My mother held him for 2 days before he died. The facts about that incident are not well known for me because I came along so much later. And I hated to ask questions about it because it was so painful for my parents. And then Herman Edward Barnes and Theron Ernest Barnes. Theron was 11 years older than I when I was born. So actually, my parents were more like my grandparents in age. So actually, my oldest brother, Reed, was at Stanford University when I was born and was pretty embarrassed over me. He majored in geology and became one of the well-known geologists of the United States. He found the oil fields in Montana and developed them for the Shell Oil Company. And at what time he was the oil man of the year. We always had guns around the house. They were just in a side porch, available at any time, rifles and shotguns, and Reed was a marksman, and he, besides being an oil man and his name in the paper quite often, he also was on the sports page for bowling and for his marksmanship. And he was the top marksman of the year for the whole country. He was on the board of the NRA. There were just many things about his life that I truly don't know because there's such an age difference. In later years, I met a woman through an organization that I belong to, which is PEO, and she mentioned that her husband had retired from the Shell Oil Company. And in just jesting, I said, well, maybe he might know my brother, Reed Barnes. And she said, well, I'll ask him. And the next thing I knew, I was invited to their home for a luncheon. And when I walked in and met her husband, he treated me like royalty. He said, oh, I never thought in my life that I would meet the sister of Thomas Barnes. In business, they called him Tom. And he praised him, and I was rather taken aback, thinking, but he was so hard to get along with. In my family, there was no gray position. It was either black or white. My dad was like that, and my brother Reed was like that. Either it was right or it was wrong, and there was no excuses. This man said, yes, of course he was hard to get along with. He was a genius, and went on to tell me what wonderful times they had together at their parties, which meant going out and hiking over the terrain that might possibly hold oil and was worth exploring. That was their parties. Reed married Jean in later life and had 2 children, Susan and Tom. Herman was completely different. He was 4 years younger than Reed, and he was extremely good looking. Even the pictures I have of him today in my room, whenever anyone comes in, they'll say, who is this movie star? Never knew a stranger. He was an entrepreneur, as his grandfather was, and he became the mayor of Glendale, hoping to go into politics, which he later found was not his cup of tea. He was very popular, and I lived with him for a year when I was a teenager out of high school, and they were wonderful hosts and hostesses. They gave wonderful gourmet dinners for their friends, and Herman was quite fortunate as a businessman. He married Celia Logan in Glendale, and they had 2 children, Tom and Carol. They had a beautiful home in the hills of Glendale, and not enough room for a swimming pool, so they put in a badminton court. Badminton was very popular then, and we had a lot of really good times. And when I lived there and entertained friends, it was lots of fun to play badminton. And Theen was 4 years younger than Herman, but he was very quiet, not outgoing at all, loved to read, had very high morals. The one thing about Theen is that he never talked about anybody or blamed anybody or gossiped. He would always say, you don't know what that person has been through to cause him to be like that. And that was because when he was 11, he read the story of the Irishman who left his one child in the care of his beloved dog as he went out hunting for food. His wife had died and there was no one to care for this child. When he came back, he saw blood all over the house and it in disarray, and he thought that his dog had attacked the child, and he killed the dog. But then he found out that the dog had kept the child from being abducted, and he fought the people who came in to take the child. He blamed himself and could never forgive himself for assuming that the dog had killed the child. That stayed with him all his life, and that was the kind of person he was. He married Bobby Edgeman, and they had 2 children, Samuel and Barbara. After I graduated from high school in Taft, I attended Taft Junior College for 1 semester and then became ill, and my dad retired. We moved to Moro Bay. They had a house built there, and my mother particularly loved it because it was so foggy. She said after all the years of living in the San Joaquin Valley, the temperature being so hot, and she dried out, and that the fog was just simply seeped into her and made her feel so good. While the rest of us hated to see the fog, she loved it. I attended San Luis Obispo Junior College for a semester, and then went to live in Glendale with my brother Herman and Celia, his wife Celia. And then when I came back, my dad really loved Moro Bay, and one of my memories of him was climbing Moro Rock. I have a picture of him standing on top of Moro Rock. His grandchildren, Tommy and Carol Ann, Herman's children, and a bit of fog in the background. We were able to climb Moro Rock because the CCC had built steps at the base of the rock and then a trail farther on up, and that was one of my dad's favorite things to do. This was just one thing that they did that I remember particularly, are those steps leading up to the trail on Moro Rock. And then World War II came along, and that had to be blasted out to make a breakwater for the bay, and the Navy moved in, and it was a base for their boats. My dad then got a job as the night watchman on one of the dredges that dredged the bay to make it deep enough for these boats to come in. He loved that, being there at night when there were long pauses when all he could do was just sit there and write the time down. But he loved being there at night and looking at the stars and looking at the ocean coming in, and he formed a new philosophy of life for him by accepting the fact that there is a God and that there is a plan for the world. For the first time in his life, he had time to think and to philosophize, and in a place that gave him a lot of peace of mind and encouraged him to think about his life. Theen married Bobby. He brought her over to the oil fields, and they lived in what had formerly been the bunkhouse, it was called, for the workers who weren't married and didn't have homes. But they changed it into a one-family building. Bobby was so full of energy and love of life, and she loved my mother and father. She was just like a playmate for me. I had never had anyone near where I lived. In fact, I never played with anybody until I went to kindergarten, which was difficult because it was hard to share. Bobby played with me, and we built things. We built a dollhouse. She just encouraged me in so many ways. When I went to my first prom, she came up and dressed me and was so happy for me. And of course, no one thought to take pictures, not even when Don and I were married. They forgot to take pictures, so we don't have anything to show for that date. We were married in February 1944. Actually, Bobby introduced me. Don was her brother-in-law's brother. And she said to me, "You've got to meet this good-looking man." And she practically dragged me down to her house to meet him. But he went overseas to the South Pacific, and we lost track of one another in a way. But when he came back, we were married and began my short life as a military wife. We had 3 children, William Thomas, Nancy Reed, and Linda Jean. They were 2.5 years apart. But this was after the war was over and we were back in California again. We started out in Salinas and then moved to Moro Bay, and then to Santa Barbara. We lived in Carpinteria, and then to Long Beach. And there we purchased a house in Lakewood Village, which was just over the Los Angeles River from Disneyland. We were there when it was built, and it was a place that was fun to go. Also, we spent a lot of time at the beach, in Laguna Beach particularly, in a cove that was more or less isolated. And then we moved back to Santa Barbara and lived there for about 15 years. The children all graduated from high school there. And when the last one went off to college, we moved to Salinas again. And then Hollister, and then we retired, or Don retired from Hayward Lumber, and we lived in Sonora, and we're living there when he passed away in 1991. Darren and I were the closest of all of us, and he was so excited when it was possible to have computers. And we were closer, I think, during that time when he could help me tracing our ancestors in genealogy. He loved to do research, and he would do anything to help me. And to be fair, so did my brother Herman, helped me so much in anything I wanted to do. He donated money when we began hospice in Hollister. A group of us began a hospice before there was any really knowledge of what it was and what it could do. We maintained it until the government began support of hospice. My father came from Missouri. His parents were Mary and Samuel. During the flu epidemic in 1911, my grandmother was dying, and her youngest daughter said, "Don't worry, Mother, I'll stay here and take care of Dad." And she said, "No, I want you to go to California with your brothers because your father is going to follow me within a week." This was said about a man who was healthy and had never been ill. But within a week, my grandfather had died of the flu too. This was noted in her obituary in the paper that she had anticipated my grandfather's death. My mother had been raised on the ranch in Reedley, which had been named after her father. She was quite used to having a lot of people around and horses and fields of wheat. Her brothers all worked in the wheat fields and in farming. My mother, raised on the ranch with so many people around, made a big step when she married Tom Barnes and they went off to one of her dad's holdings in the valley where the oil fields had just begun, out of Fellows and Taft, 10 miles from Taft. It was pretty isolated, no neighbors, nobody. She saw the man who brought the groceries once a month. It was a really shock to her to not have people and livestock around and neighbors, and her dreams of going to college were shattered, of course. But she was quite a leader in everything that she turned to. When PTA was really vital in changing the schools, and she was immediately elected president in both elementary school and high school. She was one of the first women to vote. In fact, she was in charge of and would drive to Bakersfield, which was 50 miles, to pick up all the supplies, to set it up, to register people, etc., and then to count the votes and take all that back to Bakersfield the next morning. And sometimes she didn't even go to bed that night. So anything that she touched, she was usually the leader. One of the things she did for me was to keep me in fashion. She would find the latest fashions, find patterns that were either of that fashion or close to. She would shop for material that was of good quality, in some cases very fine quality, and make up this new fashion for me to wear. I really didn't appreciate it then, but now I look back and think how fashion conscious she was for me. I wore one of the first skirts that buttoned over shorts so that you could take your skirt off and play a game and then put your skirt back on and look presentable. Also, the culottes, a skirt that was actually pants, I wore the first one of that in town. She was a very fine seamstress, and her quilts were beautiful. These were all sewn on a treadle machine that are antiques now. I guess there were electric sewing machines, but we didn't have electricity, only gas lights, and everything was, if possible, was run by gas. Don's name was Donald Forrest Allen. He was born in Santa Barbara. I had fallen in love with Santa Barbara when I was about 11, and my father took us down while he attended the Sansom Clinic. His mother was from West Virginia. His father was from Iowa. He had two brothers, one older, Edwin, and one younger, Richard. It had always been my dream to live in Santa Barbara, and we were fortunate to have our children, to live there and have our children all go to school there. We had the best of the beaches and the best of the mountains. As far as I'm concerned, it's the best place in the world to live. But growing up there, Don didn't really have that affection for it. There were so many wealthy families there. There were many things that they did that weren't possible for a person without the means to enjoy. A Hope Ranch was bordered on the beach, and they had their own private beach that only people who lived there could go. So as he grew up, he was able to stand at the gate and let those people in and tell people not to go in. They couldn't go in. He was that close, but he couldn't be at the beach himself. These things hurt young people, particularly when you're in other organizations with them and you can't enjoy all the same things that they enjoy. One of the big hurts that Don felt was the fact that he couldn't graduate from high school because he didn't have any credits left. In Santa Barbara High School, they were given 100 credits when they entered, and for every mistake they made or every error in judgment, they had points taken away. Don was always caught smoking in the bushes, and he didn't pay much attention to that. But suddenly all his points were gone and they wouldn't give him a diploma. This really hurt him. So he joined the military. He didn't know what he was getting into. He had no idea. He just knew he needed to get away. So he joined the military and earned enough credits in school to come back and demand his diploma. So there were a lot of memories that he had of Santa Barbara that weren't as much fun as it could have been for him. But he admitted it was his own fault. And Don always felt that he wasn't quite as good as his older brother because he hadn't gone to college, and Ed had. While we were living in Santa Barbara, he had the opportunity to attend some classes at the university, and he realized, I think, that he could have gone to college and he could have succeeded there. His mother and father were a lot of fun too. They had many, many friends, and they loved to play poker. They had many, many poker parties at their house. His mother was beautiful, and she had been beautiful as a young girl. She was her father's boy, so to speak. She loved to dare to do anything that a boy would. When she was ready to go to high school, her father enrolled her in a school across the river, and he would rent a house over there for her mother and sisters to live in while Katie attended high school. From what she told me, their high school was equivalent of college now. She took German. She had to write a play in German, and they actually put this play on as a graduation requirement. My children have the heritage of strong women, intelligent women, and women who could have changed the world had they had more opportunities. Don's father was actually named Forrest Oak, but he was always called Bill, and he preferred Bill. He started out working for the Ford Company, sold cars, but then during the Depression, they closed the company there, and he went to work for the U.S. Forest Service, which took him away from home all week up in the mountains above Santa Barbara. He was in charge of the equipment and did a very, very fine job for them. Then he was home on weekends. Don's mother, Kathleen, called Katie, would have to stretch their grocery money for all week. So as Don remembers it, she would buy a pot roast for Sunday meal, and then that had to be their meal for the rest of the week. So money was very, very scarce then. And then the war, Bill was transferred to the Salinas area, and there he invented a way to harvest waiuli, which was a substitute for rubber that they had to use during the war. He was honored for that, which made a big difference in how waiuli was utilized then. He was quite an inventor and always inventing a better way to do something or make something. Kathleen was more on the wild side in that she loved to do anything that was daring. One time, Don borrowed a motorcycle during the lunch hour when he was attending Santa Barbara High School. And he came home and he said to his mom, "Would you like to go for a ride?" And she said, "Of course." She called her bridge club and said, I'm pretty sick. I'm not going to be able to attend bridge today. You'll have to find somebody else." So off they went, roaring down the highway, passing cars. And one of them, as she looked back, had all the members of her bridge club. And that was a little difficult to live down for her. But that's just the way she was. There were horses in the field next to their house in Salinas. And she went over the fence and climbed on one of the horses, not knowing if it was broken or what kind of a horse it was. She took a little ride. I think my children have benefited from that. Don's older brother, Ed, was quite prominent in developing the rocket science. He married Margaret Edgman, my sister-in-law, Bobby's sister, and they had 3 children, Susan, Claudia, and David, and their ages were just in between Bill, Nancy, and Linda. I always wanted 6 children, and the 3 of them were at our house a lot, and they all got along so well and had so much fun together, and I just loved always having them there. They even developed a club, the Allen Letter and Travel Club, and they enjoyed that. Don's younger brother, I actually introduced him to my niece, Carol, and they were married and had 4 girls, Diane, Debbie, Denise, and Dana. Dick was a postman, and he also had a heart defect. Don said he remembers hearing Dick's heartbeat across the room. It had a hole in it. And it was predicted that he wouldn't live to be a teenager. So his dad said, "Well, if that's what's going to happen, I want him to be a normal child and be treated that way." So he never kept the other boys from roughhousing him and teasing him, and he let Dick do anything he wanted to be a normal person. Well, as you know, he outlived that prediction. When the open heart surgery began, he was eager to do that. His doctor didn't feel that at first that it was a good thing. He wanted to wait to see how it worked out. But eventually, Dick did have open heart surgery, and they discovered 2 holes in his heart that had to be patched. But after that, he was fine. It was a little hard recovering with 4 little girls around, so afraid they might jump on him as he was lying down, but he got through it just fine. Soon after retiring, other complications began, and he passed away in his 50s. Dick and Don were especially close. Although Dick was 8 years younger than Don always loved children or babies, so he was delighted when Dick came along, his baby, and they always were close. A lot alike in personality. They both were good at making you laugh. Not a day went by that Don didn't make me laugh, and that's probably why I'm still here. Dick loved to tell jokes and was very good at joke telling. If he didn't break up before he ended the joke in laughing at himself. This probably came from their dad, who always made people laugh too, just by the way they looked at life, a bit askew. Don's dad rolled his own cigarettes with his loose tobacco, and consequently, as he smoked, the ashes dropped on his shirt and made little holes all over it. And so I don't think there was a shirt he had that didn't have at least 3 holes in it. So one of his nieces, who was quite close to Don's dad, sent him a shirt once with little holes burned all over it. She said she thought she would do it for him before he had a chance to do it himself. The family of 3 boys and their dad were all practical jokers. In fact, Don's dad, Bill, and his brother, Foss, played practical jokes on each other and their brothers growing up. Some of them were horrifying, actually, bordering on very dangerous, but that seemed to be the fun that they had. So then his dad with his 3 boys were constantly doing practical jokes too. One time when Ed was lying on the couch asleep, his dad took a coin and lay it on the gas heater until it was red hot, and then placed it on Ed's stomach. And then Ed and Don were sitting on the porch one time with the gun between them, air rifle between them, pointed at Ed, and Don just reached down and pulled the trigger. They had a tent out in the backyard, and they got Dick, their younger brother, to get in the tent and to push his rear end against the tent, and they shot him that way, shot his butt that way. There was also a beach called Hendry's Beach in Santa Barbara, which was kind of remote from the regular beach, and it had a little inlet which the kids would put planks out and kind of use it for a boat. So one time they actually had a little rowboat in this inlet, and they put Dick in it and pushed it out, and then they all started throwing rocks at it. Fortunately, he wasn't hurt, but they lived dangerously then. They would go down in the morning and get chum, and they'd get day-old bread. They'd eat some and they'd throw some out to attract the fish. They'd fish all day there, or as long as they wanted, then go walk up to Henry's Beach, and they could go out in the water without any clothes on there, spend the day, rest of the day, and then walk home at night without anybody worrying about them. They just enjoyed life. Ed and Don's personalities were so different. Don was always so easygoing and laughing, and Ed was very serious and very intellectual. Ed moved around the country a lot in his business. He lived in Texas and he lived in Alabama near the Rocket Center. Weather there was so humid, but it didn't bother him at all, and he really loved living on a lake with a boat. Of all of my family, my father probably influenced me the most, in that he encouraged me to think for myself. He told me not to ever go along with the crowd just because they were going, but to think it out myself, particularly about joining any organizations or churches. Although I rejected his feelings of black and white, that was hard on me because I was in the gray zone so often. But then my mother influenced me too, not in words, but with her eyes. Her eyes told me, stop that, don't do that. Her eyes said, you better not, or else. And that's all she had to do. My dad sang a lot of songs to me. And he woke me up every morning with a poem. And that was really special. When it was too hot in the house, we would lay out on the lawn at bedtime and stay there until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when a little breeze would come up. My mother used to say, of all the places they could have built a house, that was perfect, because we were on a hill, on the top of a hill. And if there was any breeze at all, we would finally feel the breeze. And then we would go inside. Our gas lights also made it too hot to be inside in the summertime. They would give off quite a bit of warmth. It was nice in the wintertime. My dad would come into my room every morning and say, "The bird is up to meet the sun, something, da da da." I have it written down someplace, but I don't know it by heart. My dad had spent like 6 months in college. He didn't have any money, so he was working his way through by taking care of the furnace room for the buildings. And he just couldn't do it all. He had to go from building to building and take care of the furnace and keep them going all winter long. And to study then and keep up in his classes, he finally gave up and went home. My dad went to Raleigh, Missouri, to college, probably the closest to home. He had been the singing master for the singing school. One of the things I think that he was most proud of. In those days, a musician would go from town to town and have singing schools and would find someone in the neighborhood who excelled in singing to lead it. And he had been chosen to lead this singing school and was most proud of that, I think. So, and his songs, I thought that he had made them up and that they were his own experiences for a long time, until I realized that they were just songs that he had learned. Like "Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie" was one that he sang a lot, and "Laying Out Under the Stars" with no other lights around. It was quite impressive to me. My father had four brothers and 5 sisters, and one of his sisters, the youngest one who came to California, lived in Montebello, and her husband was an oil man. Once a year we were able to get away to go to visit them, and they also lived on top of a hill. They had a wonderful grape arbor, and every year my father and Uncle George would pick the grapes, and my mother and Auntie Node, we called her name was Nora, would wash the grape and boil them and can the juice. Oh, that grape juice was so good. And then my mother used it all year long as a drink or in different dishes that she made. But that week of sleeping in their bedroom on top of the hill and looking out at all the lights of Southern California from there around Montebello was always a delight for me. Auntie Node was so delicate and refined, and was just a lovely, lovely person. And her daughters, their daughters too, Elizabeth and Imogene. My father was the superintendent of the Tumbador Oil Company, and the owners were a few men who lived in San Francisco. They totally trusted him to take care of this whole system, and he was, again, black and white. He wouldn't even let me take a piece of their stationery to write on, or one of their pencils to write with. I was not to touch any of it. That would be stealing. And he felt that way about his responsibility to the wells. We would be ready to take a vacation, and he would come in and say, "Well, we can't go because such and such well is down. Number 2 or number 8 is down, and we have to pull it, so I can't go." He would not ever give his responsibility over to anybody else. We were away one time for a couple of days in one of the houses. There are actually 3 leases, and one of the houses on another lease burned down, and he was sure it wouldn't have burned if he had been there. And so after that, he wouldn't go away at all for a vacation. So to get away for a week and to go down to visit Uncle George and Aunt Nora were just amazing to me and really appreciated. My mother had 3 sisters. Her older sister was Nina. Her younger sisters were Imogene and Dolly. They were just a year apart, and Imogene thought that the new baby was her Dolly, so that's what they named her. And then there were 2 older brothers, Horace and Ed. The Tumbador Oil Company is still there. All the that I can see is just a board with that name on it. Where the wells are, I have no idea, or if they're even there. But there is a sign that says Tumbadora Oil Company, halfway between Fellas and McKittrick. After my grandfather, Thomas Law Reed, died, the ranch went to the two sons, Horace and Ed. The girls each received $1,000. Due to the business economy, the ranch was sold and is now the land that Reedley Community College is on. In front of the college is a stone monument with an etching of the ranch on it and the story behind it. I was always close to Bobby and her family. We remained close throughout the years. Computers made it possible for us to communicate. When we were older and not able to travel so much, we still could talk to each other, write to each other every day. Bobby and Theen are both buried in a little cemetery in Cayucas, where my mother and father are buried. It's a beautiful little place within sight of the ocean, and that's where my dad had said he wanted to be buried, in sight of the ocean. My husband, Don, is buried in Reedley, the Reedley Cemetery, and his flag and his father's flag both fly on holidays. I have a picture of the two flags flying toward each other as if saluting each other. It's quite an unusual picture.